talk about filling and stroking. And when you apply a fill to an image, you're basically applying a color, a pattern, or a gradient to part or all of the image. And you can do it to a much larger area, which makes it a lot quicker. First of all, we're going to start out by talking about the Paint Bucket Fill tool. The Paint Bucket Fill tool is located right below your brush tool. And it's right there. It says Paint Bucket Tool and it's K. So if you hit K on your keyboard, that will bring up your Paint Bucket Fill tool. And you'll know when you have your Paint Bucket Fill tool by the little icon that you have on your cursor. It looks like a piece of paper with an arrow pointing down to it to show the fill. And when you select the paint bucket tool, it's a lot like selecting a paintbrush. You select the tool and then you're going to come down here to your options panel and decide what options you want to use for the paint bucket. Now you have the two options. You have paint, and when you come over paint, it's going to tell you that that's the foreground fill color that you're using. Or right here you have the choice to do a pattern fill, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And when you have your paint selected, you have the choice of setting your opacity and your tolerance. Now right now I have a blank canvas. It's all completely white. But if I go and let's say that we open a picture. If you have the entire select all selected, then with the tolerance, 255 is how far it goes up. So that's going to give you pretty much everything. It's at 52 opacity, so you can still see the image through it, but you can see that you put a nice little fill color over the top of your image. Now let's go and undo that. And if you go up to 100, you'll see that with 255, you're filling everything. Next, let's talk about mode. You remember blending modes from the last lesson, and you have your choice here. You can go with normal, or you can do something else to make it blend with the picture a little bit more. So you have those options. And the next couple things that you've got going on in your options panel is you can select all layers, and this will go ahead and fill not just the layer that you're working on, but all layers in the canvas. This image currently only has one layer, but if you had, say, 6 layers and you wanted to fill all of them, you would select all layers. As a good general rule, you're probably going to want to keep your fills separated on a separate layer, and then at the very end when you're done editing, you're going to merge your layers together and create one composite image. And then you can save a version that has all your layers and save a version that has just simply one layer. So for right now, I would keep that unchecked. And then you have your typical contiguous pixels, which is pixels that are touching each other, and anti-aliasing. Anti-aliasing is just to smooth the edge transition, and it's a good thing to just keep those checked. So now that you have your options looked at, let's go up here and let's find something to fill. Now maybe we want to do something where we pull out this flower area, and instead of having this background of the leaves behind it, we want to have a little more separation between the two. So we're going to go in with the magic wand and we're going to select the background by selecting this flower, but then we're doing a subtract from selection. And because we're doing subtract from selection, we're selecting the inverse of the flower, which means everything but what we're actually painting over. So we're going to do that. And as you can see, we now have this background selected. You can see it by the marching dots. Although it's kind of hard to tell because if you had the flower selected, you'd see pretty much the same thing, except for you wouldn't have this border around it on the outside. That's what tells you that you're selecting the inverse. Now I missed some stuff right here, so let's go in and say add to selection, and let's just click there, and that's really small, so let's give it a little more room and click in there, and then click a little bit in here, and that looks good enough. So now that we have that selected, let's go back to our fill tool. And we could go with the chartreuse, or we could do something a little more organic. You can come up, if you go from the color picker and you go directly into your photo, you see that you get your eyedropper tool. And you can select a color directly from there. And you see it gave me kind of a black color from this background. So let's go ahead, and it's a little dark, so let's select a different one. Still a little dark. These are all pretty dark. Let's try that. And now let's find a mode. We can do an opacity of 100, or if we just want to kind of have this background still just barely there, we can go ahead with a 68. And then let's move the tolerance up to a 202. And let's do Let's just leave it in normal. And now we're just going to go over the area that we've selected and just anywhere in that area that's selected, just click on it. And as you can see, you filled in that entire background area with a fill color. And that's how you use the paint bucket tool. Now the paint bucket tool looks okay, but I think I'd like to do something a little more interesting. So let's go ahead and Control Z and get rid of that. And using the same selection, let's try and use the gradient tool and put a gradient over the top. And to do that, you're going to select this gradient right here, right next to the paint bucket tool. And it's a G, so if you just want to hit G on your keyboard, that'll bring it up. And when you bring up the gradient option panels, you'll see that you have this gradient showing right here. And then there's going to be a downward arrow next to it. And when you hit that, you're actually going to get this window that will show you different gradients. And if you select that, you're selecting different gradients which you can use in the background. When you click on the downward button, you click the panel, you will go into that, which also gives you the different gradients, but it gives you also this bar right here. And this bar is actually showing you the gradient. So right now we're selected on this blue, yellow, blue, and this is the actual gradient and where you edit it. And these are called opacity stops and color stops. And when you double click, you get a color picker. And that's where you can change the color of that color stop. And each color stop shows you that you have gray going to here, and then the color stops, and then the next color is yellow, and it starts to blend to yellow until it gets the brightest right there, and then it starts to blend to the next color stop, which is this blue. And all you have to do, once again, to change them, double click, pick a color, hit OK. And then you can actually move these color stops around by clicking and dragging right and left, and you can move them to change the colors in your gradient and how your gradient looks. Let's go ahead and hit OK. And what you do to use the gradient tool is you have your little pointer and you click inside that selection, and this time instead of just clicking, you actually want to drag and pull down in the direction you want the gradient to go. Now I'm going to have it go at kind of an angle. And as you can see, it starts with that gray color and goes out to a yellow. And it's a little bit more interesting and softer looking than a full color. And gradients are great if they're really in a light opacity. Let's go down and go Control Z. If you do them with a light opacity and a blend mode, like say soft light, and then you pull it over, they give you a really subtle effect. Like there. You can barely see the opacity at all, but what it did was it actually gave you some brightness in the background. If you can go Control Z, it just kind of changed the background slightly. You can reverse your gradient, and when you reverse the gradient, then anything on the right side of the gradient, right here you have the opacity on the right side, and you see here you have the black color on the right side and the green on the left. When you reverse it, it's going to be reversed. The black is going to be on the left and the green is going to be on the right. Here's where you check whether you want transparent or not, and just go ahead and I leave that checked. And then you can select a dither, and for our purposes we're just going to leave that alone. And the more important thing is right here, and this is where you select the kind of gradient that you're going to use. Now we've been using the linear fill. Now you can change that. You can go here to a radial gradient. And in a radial gradient, what it does is instead of going in a linear fashion this direction, it's going to start in the center and work its way out. Let me show you what that looks like. And to show this well, we'll probably have to go up to normal and 100%, and then let's go, and then this time I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to click inside the flower. Now it's not going to fill the flower because the flower is not selected, but we're going to center the gradient inside the flower here. We're going to click and drag to the corner, and there we go. This is a radial gradient. It started in the center and then it radiated out from the center to the edges of your canvas. In an angle gradient, you have shades in a counterclockwise sweep around the starting point. Next you have reflected gradient. And reflected gradient, what it does is it cuts your selection in half And then whatever you see on the top side of the screen, you're also going to see on the bottom side of the screen, reflected like a mirror. And there's only one more to talk about, and that's this diamond pattern. And the diamond gradient, it does what it says. It starts out in the middle and it goes off in kind of a diamond formation from the center. And there you have your diamond gradient. Now the next thing we need to talk about is how to do a pattern fill. And if you go back to the paint bucket tool again, remember that was K if you want to bring it up quickly. And back in the options panel, we went ahead and we used the foreground color fill, but next to that was the pattern fill. And go ahead and click on the pattern fill, and your pattern and what you're actually filling with is shown right here. That's your little pattern preview. And right now it looks like bubbles or DNA, and it's hard to kind of visualize what this is going to look like because what you're looking at is a small sample of what a small area filled will look like. And when you actually fill it in, it's going to fill a larger area. So what does that mean? Let me show you. Once again, we have this background selected, and you've got your pattern selected here. And you've got the same options that you had when you were in the paint bucket foreground fill color mode. We're going to leave those all the same for right now and just show you what the pattern fill will look like. Go ahead and click this, and that's what your pattern fill looks like. And that was on 69% opacity, so you can still see a bit of the background behind it. But you can see there's a bit of a texture now in your background. So let's go ahead and get Control Z. And we could play with this bubbles a little bit more, but you actually have some more options with your fill. By going to this downward arrow and clicking on that, you're going to come to this little screen, and you'll see this menu here of little thumbnails, and these are different patterns that you can try out to see how they work in your photo. You can keep playing around until you find something you like. Well, you're not just stuck with the default. If you go here to the downward arrow, you can also pick other patterns that are loaded on your computer. Now, the only thing else that you really need to know about patterns is that you're not limited to these patterns that are loaded with the program. You can add patterns, and we talked about the preset manager earlier. You can go there directly from clicking this little bar right here and then going into your preset manager, or you can load patterns directly from this menu. And if you have patterns that are loaded onto your computer that you maybe downloaded from the internet, and then you'd hit the load button if you had some, and they would start showing up in your pattern panel. So that's something you can do. You can also create your own patterns, and I'm going to show you how to do that. Let's go ahead and add this pattern here. And let's do a hard light, and let's go ahead and fill. And then you've got this kind of wacky thing going on here in the background. Now if you go and you use a zoom tool, you zoom in, and like right here you have some splotchiness. So let's take our rectangular marquee tool and select this area right in there. And when you have this square selected, you can actually go up to Edit and Define Pattern from Selection. Click on that, and it will give you this box, and that box is actually the pattern that you're creating right here. And you just give it a name. And now when you go back to your fill bucket, go here, and you'll see right there, swatchy 64 by 64 pixels in RGB mode. Let's talk about how to work with strokes. And we can actually outline this flower to give it a little more definition. So let's go ahead and select our quick selection tool, and let's pick our flower. And now that our flower is selected, let's go to Edit, Stroke Outline Selection, and that's going to bring up a little dialog box. And it will ask you, or how big do you want the width of the stroke to be? And at 1 pixel, you're going to have a thin line. If you go up to 10, you're going to have a pretty thick stroke. Let's just go ahead and use 5 pixel outside line and hit OK. Let's go up to our magnifying glass and let's zoom in. As you can see, that stroke just provided a little more definition between your foreground object and the background. And that's strokes and how to use them.